July of 2013, Google announced the second generation Nexus 7, the successor to a truly amazing tablet that offered some of the best specs for the time at an affordable price. So Google had to topple that, and they did. The Nexus 7 2013 saw a massive upgrade in all aspects over its predecessor, while keeping a low price. This being one of the reasons why people even to this day still hold it at a high regard, and as a result has a strong community behind that supports and keeps it up to date. But despite the good specs it had when it was released, it's been 9 years since its launch. So today we'll see how this tablet has aged and what can still do and cannot do after all these many years. Starting off with the design, the Nexus 7 has a 7-inch screen with a 16:10 aspect ratio. Next to the screen we got these big bezels, which some people didn't like so much in 2013, and now in a world of nearly bezel-less phones, this is even more noticeable. Though in my case I don't mind them at all, in fact I actually find them useful to hold the tablet without having to smash the screen with my fingers, and I also think they give the tablet a certain personality that I find so likable. These bezels also hide the selfie camera and the LED for notifications. And you're probably wondering, Kevin, what's that horrendous thing on the top bezel? The thing is, I broke the screen 2 years ago in a really nasty fall, so I put that patch there to hide the broken glass and avoid getting dirt in there. On the back we've got the 5 megapixel camera, the Nexus logo, and this nice texture which provides extra grip and feels really nice to the touch. See, back then we had a higher variety of materials to choose from. This back cover is also pretty easy to remove. Inside, we can spot the stereo speakers on both sides, the battery, and this metal thingy which hides the processor. Speaking of which, I've seen some people actually replace the metal plate for one made of copper and use high quality thermal paste to reduce heat. So we can also find the wireless charging coil and this small piece of foam, which usually would wear out after a couple years, which then lead to ghost touches. Sometimes getting really out of control, like in my case. Though the fix was pretty simple, I just glued some foam on top of the old ones to reinforce the ribbons, and that was it. Software-wise, the Nexus 7 came out with Android 4.3, being the first Android device to ever get this version of Android at launch. It went on to receive Android KitKat, Lollipop, and to finally die on Android 6, version that in my experience is still usable today. However, I went a little further and installed Android 7, which in my experience runs better than the stock ROM, while providing us with unique functions as well as a security patch up to September 2020, which is not that bad. Android 7 is compatible with almost everything, and given how smooth it runs, I haven't had the need to install more recent versions, but because how much love the Nexus 7 gets by its community, you can't even put Android 12 on it, which is awesome. Using the Elementor kernel and the app of the same name, we can take the Nexus 7 from the default 1.5 GHz all the way to 2.2 GHz. Surprisingly, even at that high clock speed, it's pretty stable, and the reason is, we're not doing a massive overclock despite what it seems. See, this tablet actually features the Snapdragon 600 and not the Snapdragon S4 Pro as Google claims. When people open it up to see its insides, they noticed the processor inside had nothing in common with the previous generation, and the tablet in fact uses the more powerful Snapdragon 600, and the thing is, that processor is clocked above 1.7 GHz, and maybe the reason they said it had an older processor was because they reduced the clock speed down to 1.5 GHz, but even at this clock speed, it easily outperforms the S4 Pro. Anyway, it was a strange decision by Google to claim its product had an older processor than it actually had. So, knowing the default clock speed of the Snapdragon 600 is 1.7 GHz, and how some devices that use this processor like the Galaxy S4 by default run at 1.9 GHz, so by putting the tablet at 2.2 GHz, technically we wouldn't be doing a 0.7 GHz overclock, but only 0.31, and so I think that's the reason it's pretty stable at higher frequencies. Knowing the default clock speed of the Snapdragon 600 is 1.7 GHz, and how some devices that use the same processor like the Galaxy S4 by default run at 1.9 GHz, we could explain why it's so stable at high frequencies, because technically we wouldn't be doing a 0.7 GHz overclock, but only 0.31. In my case though, I keep the clock speed at 1.9 GHz, because the difference beyond this is very small. Apart from all of this, we can also increase the clock speed of the GPU, which could come in handy for gaming. The app also lets us change energy profiles, monitor temperatures of each core, among other things. The Nexus 7 has 2 GB of RAM, which might not sound like much, but what I find surprising is how good the RAM management is, allowing us to have several apps open at the same time or use multi-window. And this brings us to web browsing. In other devices I've had with the same RAM, the tabs refresh after a certain number, which is really annoying. But here that's not a problem. We can have lots of them open without having to worry about reloads. As for the navigation itself, it's okay. It clearly doesn't load pages as fast as newer devices, and depending on the page, it can get somewhat laggy. But I think it's still usable for this activity. When it comes to media consumption, we have YouTube, which works well, though we're limited to 1080p 30 or 720p 60. The Full HD screen still looks great in my opinion, but can't say the same for the stereo speakers, which are one of the weakest points of the tablet, since they sound so quiet even at max volume. But we can always use the headphone jack or even Bluetooth as an alternative. The HBO Max app plays movies and series in 1080p just fine, since most of them are shot in 24 frames per second, though when switching between the menus, there's a delay. I thought it was the tablet at first, but then I noticed the app itself is part of the problem since it also runs so bad on other Android devices I have at home. Most social media apps still run fine, like in the case of Instagram that despite not having a tablet version, it still looks great because the screen is only 7 inches. One thing that surprised me is how good the GPS is. Devices from this time usually take more than 30 seconds to find my location on Strava, but in this case it found me in less than 5 seconds. So if you want to adapt this tablet on your car and use it for navigation, it's not a bad option. Thanks to having a high-end processor from 2013, we'll be able to play all the top games of its time, and even some newer games like the case of Call of Duty Mobile, which is playable here. Of course, with graphic quality set on low and frame rate at medium. Anyway, it's amazing it runs the game this well. Sadly, can't say the same for Battle Royale, where the tablet struggles more in the open world maps, but given its age, it's still very impressive. The latest version of Minecraft runs okay with some graphic settings off and chunks set on 6. However, there's this annoying lag in the menus, and when we play heavy maps, the tablet struggles a lot. GTA San Andreas medium graphics has a good performance. From time to time, there are some frame drops when there are many cars or NPCs on screen, but despite all of this, it's still perfectly playable just like previous GTA titles. And Need for Speed Most Wanted runs flawlessly given how these games were made to be played on all devices like this one. One of my favorite games, Max Payne, runs with everything set on max. No lag issues at all. I can even use a PS3 controller for a better experience, which is amazing. Moving on to emulation, all consoles prior to the PS1 and N64 era run with no problems, so I'm gonna skip them and go straight to PSP emulation, which is way more demanding. With this console, I found that most games run very well, even top games for the console such as the Third Birthday, which runs even at 2x resolution, having pretty much perfect frame rate. Then we've got Manhunt 2, which runs nicely without touching any of the settings, though it'll get a little bit laggy when there are many NPCs on screen. On the other hand, there are a few games where the performance leaves much to be desired. One of these games is God of War Chains of Olympus, which is one of the most demanding games for the PSP. The performance itself is not terrible and it's fairly playable, but it's far from perfect. Dreamcast emulation in my testing is quite bad. I tried to run Shenmue for this video, but it didn't work in any of the emulators I tried. In the past, I tested Resident Evil Code Veronica and it actually worked, but it was laggy, and the truth is, I was too lazy to download the game again, but I'm sure smaller titles would run just fine here. Now speaking of the camera, we have a 5 megapixel sensor, which was not bad for taking photos of documents and some occasional photo. Quality wise, I find it to be above some phones of the time such as the Galaxy S3 Mini, which also has a 5 megapixel camera. As for video, we can record in 1080p at 30 frames per second, but despite a good resolution, the video quality honestly is quite bad. In conclusion, the 2013 Nexus 7 is still a legendary tablet, and because it was released with top specs, it still keeps up with most tasks even to this day. Because of this, it can still be considered the best 7-inch tablet ever, even in 2022. And if you're like me and can put up with some lag, I'd say the tablet is still worth it. Honestly, I haven't found a tablet of this size with this level of features, and unless you want to classify the Switch OLED or the Steam Deck as tablets, the Nexus 7 is still king in this category.